The morning of March 3rd, 1943, started like any other day in the Huon Gulf off the coast of New Guinea, but what unfolded in the hours that followed would fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War. Officers standing watch on the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze noticed something peculiar around 10 o'clock that morning. A formation of a dozen twin-engine aircraft was racing toward their convoy, but these planes weren't approaching at the expected high altitude. Instead, they were flying so incredibly low that the wash from their propellers was actually creating visible trails across the ocean surface. The officers raised their binoculars and counted what seemed like an impossibility. American bombers were attacking at virtually mast height, an approach that violated every principle of conventional bombing doctrine they had ever studied. What these Japanese officers were about to witness would shatter everything the Imperial Navy thought it understood about aerial warfare against ships. In the quarter hour that followed, the Japanese would lose 8 transport vessels, carrying nearly 7,000 desperately needed troops, transforming them from functioning ships into blazing wreckage scattered across the Bismarck Sea. 4 destroyer escorts that had successfully protected convoys since the attack on Pearl Harbor would be torn apart. The lives of 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors would end in those waters. Every assumption about air-sea combat that the Japanese military had held would sink along with those men and ships. The critical piece of information the Japanese lacked was the true nature of these attacking aircraft. These weren't standard bombers at all. They were B-25 Mitchell aircraft that had been radically transformed by an unconventional engineer named Paul Gunn, a man everyone called Pappy. Each of these modified bombers bristled with 8 forward-facing machine guns of 50 caliber. The engagement that was about to commence would prove that American ingenuity had created something the Japanese military establishment couldn't even conceive of existing. These were bombers that didn't drop their ordnance from safe altitudes above. Instead, they skipped their bombs across the water's surface like children skipping stones, all while unleashing continuous streams of armor-piercing rounds. The convoy that had departed from Rabaul shortly after midnight on the 1st of March represented Japan's final significant attempt to reinforce Leh using surface ships. General Hitoshi Imamura commanded the 8th Area Army, and his forces desperately required these reinforcements to maintain their hold on New Guinea, which served as the last protective barrier for the Empire's southern territories. The escort force was under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had 8 of the Imperial Navy's most veteran destroyers at his disposal. Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo formed a protective screen around the 8 transport ships. The transports themselves, Ayomaru, Kenbumaru, Kyokusei-maru, Oigawa-maru, Shinai-maru, Taimei-maru, Teiyo-maru, and the naval auxiliary vessel Nojima were loaded with the 51st Division's 6,900 elite soldiers, along with enough supplies and ammunition to sustain the Leh garrison for months to come. Every aspect of the convoy's departure had been carefully planned down to the smallest detail. Japanese meteorologists had forecast 3 days of heavy weather, which would provide ideal cover from American reconnaissance aircraft. 100 Zero fighters stationed at bases throughout New Britain and New Guinea would maintain constant air cover above the convoy. The chosen route hugged the northern coastline of New Britain, which would minimize the time spent crossing open water where they'd be vulnerable. Captain Tamichi Hara commanded the destroyer Yukikaze, and he would later write about his experiences in a book called Japanese Destroyer Captain. In recent weeks, Hara had observed troubling changes in how the Americans were conducting their air operations. Their bombers were attacking from lower and lower altitudes, and he'd noticed unusual modifications to their aircraft. When he mentioned these concerns to his superior officers, his observations were generally dismissed. The prevailing view among the higher ranks was that American desperation was driving them to make tactical errors. What the Japanese couldn't have known was that a genuine revolution in aerial combat had been taking place in workshops scattered around Port Moresby and Townsville. Starting in August of 1942, Major Paul Gunn had been systematically converting medium bombers into weapons that had never existed before. Gunn had previously served as a Navy pilot before transferring to the Army Air Forces. His innovations emerged from pure necessity rather than theoretical planning. Conventional high-altitude bombing against moving ships achieved hit rates below 1%. When bombardiers released their ordnance from 10,000 feet, even the most skilled among them struggled to hit vessels that could maneuver. Ships could observe bombs falling through the air and had several minutes to change course and avoid them. Anti-aircraft fire was devastatingly effective at medium altitudes. Something completely radical was required. Gunn began working with salvaged components from wrecked fighter aircraft, installing 4 machine guns of 50 caliber into the nose sections of B-25 bombers. He replaced the bombardier's glazed nose compartment with solid metal. Then he added 4 additional guns in packages mounted below the cockpit area. This gave each aircraft a total of 8 forward-firing weapons. Every gun could fire 850 rounds each minute, with each bullet traveling at 2,910 feet per second. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, a single B-25 could deliver 6,800 bullets per minute in a concentrated lethal stream. Major Ed Larner's 90th Bomb Squadron, which was part of the 3rd Bomb Group, had spent weeks perfecting a technique called skip bombing. The pilots would fly at 200 feet altitude or even lower, then release 500-pound bombs equipped with specially configured delay fuses. These bombs would skip across the water surface before slamming into the hulls of ships. The fuses were timed for 4 to 5 seconds, giving just enough time for the bomber to clear the area before the explosion occurred. The technique had been practiced repeatedly on a wrecked vessel called the SS Pruth in Port Moresby Harbour, until the crews could consistently hit their designated targets. Through extensive trial runs, they'd established the optimal parameters. The altitude should be between 200 and 250 feet. Speed should be maintained between 200 and 250 miles per hour. Bombs should be released when the aircraft was 60 to 100 feet from the target. The protective storm cover that the convoy was counting on began dissipating earlier than the meteorologists had predicted. At 10 in the morning on March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator conducting reconnaissance spotted the ships through a break in the cloud cover. Within hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group were airborne and heading out from Port Moresby. These B-17s attacked from 7,000 feet, which was lower than their typical bombing altitude, but still above the effective range of most anti-aircraft weapons. They bracketed the convoy with 1,000-pound demolition bombs. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the transport Kyokusei Maru took direct hits on her forward cargo holds. Fires spread rapidly to the ammunition stores, forcing the crew to abandon ship. 900 soldiers were evacuated from the burning transport onto the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo. These 2 destroyers, now dangerously overloaded with rescued men, raced ahead at high speed to Leh, where they deposited their human cargo before rejoining the convoy early on March 3rd. This emergency run succeeded in saving those 900 men, but it reduced the convoy's escort strength at precisely the wrong moment. What the Japanese didn't understand was that the B-17 attack had actually been reconnaissance by fire. The Allied planners were testing the defensive capabilities and forcing the convoy to break its tight formation in preparation for what was coming next. The morning of March 3rd dawned with clear skies over the Huon Gulf, which was disastrous for the Japanese. During the night, the convoy had rounded the Huon Peninsula and now found itself exposed in open water, only 80 miles from their destination at Leh. Safety seemed tantalizingly close. At 7:55 in the morning, lookouts aboard the Japanese vessels spotted the first wave of attacking aircraft approaching from the south. But these planes weren't flying at 7,000 feet like the B-25s from the previous day. They were skimming the tops of the waves, flying so low that spray from their propellers was clearly visible. As the aircraft closed to within 2,000 yards, their noses suddenly erupted with streams of tracer fire. 8 lines of bullets from each B-25 converged on the ships, systematically suppressing the anti-aircraft gun positions. Japanese gunners who attempted to man their weapons were cut down by the concentrated fire. Those who took cover found themselves unable to defend their ships. Following behind the strafing B-25s came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, adding their own devastating firepower to the assault. Each Beaufighter carried 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns of .303 caliber. The combined assault from American and Australian aircraft was completely overwhelming, effectively suppressing anti-aircraft defenses across the entire convoy. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron into their attack run. Flying in formations of 3 aircraft at 200 feet altitude, they bore down on the convoy at 250 miles per hour. This was the moment that months of intensive training had prepared them for. The lead bomber released its bomb approximately 300 yards from the transport Shinai Maru. The bomb struck the water, skipped twice across the surface, then slammed into the ship's hull just above the waterline. 4 to 5 seconds after release, exactly as the delay fuse was timed, it detonated inside the cargo hold. The explosion ripped the ship apart from within. The transport Kenbu Maru was loaded with drums of aviation fuel. When a skip bomb hit amidships, the explosion ignited her volatile cargo, creating a massive fireball that rose 500 feet into the air. She disintegrated within seconds, leaving nothing but burning debris scattered across the water. The Iomaru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession. Her hull opened up like someone had used a can opener on her. The Oigawa Maru was desperately trying to maneuver away from the attacking aircraft when she took bombs from 2 different B-25s simultaneously. The explosions broke her back. She jackknifed and went down within minutes. The destroyer Asashio, under the command of Captain Yasuo Sato, raced to position herself between the attackers and the vulnerable transports. She was immediately bracketed by 3 B-25s. Skip bombs slammed into her engine rooms, while thousands of machine gun bullets swept every living thing from her decks. Dead in the water and burning furiously, she became a stationary target for the following waves of attacking aircraft. By 10:15 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after Major Larner had released his first bomb, 7 of the 8 transports were either sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers, Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze, were mortally wounded and would not survive. The Shirayuki would sink later in the day. The convoy had completely ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The destruction of the ships was only the beginning of the tragedy that would unfold. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of whom couldn't swim, were thrown into the oil-covered waters of the Huon Gulf. Those who had swimming ability faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to reach the New Guinea coast through waters infested with sharks and plagued by dangerous currents, or they could cling to floating debris and hope for rescue. The destroyer Shikinami, one of the few escorts still operational, began pulling survivors from the water. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked frantically, hauling men aboard as quickly as they physically could. They managed to save approximately 300 in the first hour. Then the American planes returned for follow-up attacks. The attacks on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts. Machine gun fire churned the sea into foam. Life rafts were torn apart under concentrated fire. PT boats also participated in preventing Japanese survivors from reaching the shore, following orders to ensure that enemy soldiers wouldn't reinforce the Leh garrison. For Japanese military observers who survived this ordeal, the attack revealed a devastating truth. American innovation had created weapons they hadn't even imagined were possible. The skip bombing technique, which had been developed and perfected in just a few months, had no counter-tactic anywhere in Japanese military doctrine. Ships couldn't depress their anti-aircraft guns low enough to engage planes flying at mast height. Torpedoes were useless against aircraft. All traditional anti-aircraft doctrine was rendered completely ineffective. The firepower of the B-25s was particularly shocking to Japanese observers. Their own fighters typically carried 2 machine guns of 7.7 millimeters, occasionally supplemented by 20 millimeter cannons. These American bombers carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, the equivalent firepower of multiple fighters, all aimed forward, all controlled by a single trigger pull. Even more disturbing was the level of coordination displayed during the attack. The assault involved American B-17, B-25s, A-20 from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Beaufighters. Over 100 aircraft from different units, different services, and even different nations, all working in perfect synchronization. They communicated throughout the battle, adjusting their tactics in real time based on radio reports coming in from various sources. As night fell on March 3rd, the surviving Japanese destroyers returned to the battle site, desperately searching for survivors. What they found was a sea covered in debris and corpses. Oil fires were still burning on the water's surface. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Kavieng with fuel, which allowed the rescue operations to continue through the night hours. In total, 2,700 men were pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul. Another 1,200, including those who had been landed at Leh before the main attack, eventually made it to their destination. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes of reinforcing New Guinea, 2,890 were dead. The 51st Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force before firing a single shot at the enemy. All the ammunition, food, medicine, and equipment that was needed to sustain operations for months had gone down with the transports. The aviation fuel in the Kenbu Maru that was supposed to keep Japanese aircraft flying was now just an oil slick on the Bismarck Sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who served as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the report while in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi, which was anchored at Truk. According to staff officers who were present, he sat in complete silence for an extended period before speaking. The implications were crystal clear. Japan could no longer reinforce its forward garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied air power. The lifeline to their forward bases had been severed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented far more than just a tactical defeat. It signified a fundamental shift in how warfare was being conducted in the Pacific. Never again would the Japanese attempt to reinforce their garrisons by surface convoy when those convoys would be within range of Allied aircraft. The strategic implications rippled through every level of Japanese planning. General Imamura personally flew to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to deliver his report. In a meeting that lasted 6 hours, he presented evidence that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese ability to effectively counter it. The Americans weren't simply building more planes than Japan. They were revolutionizing the fundamental way aircraft fought. On March 25, 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement on Southwest Area operations gave priority to operations in New Guinea over those in the Solomon Islands. But without the ability to reinforce by sea, it was essentially an empty gesture. Japanese forces in New Guinea would be fighting without any hope of significant reinforcement or resupply. For the Americans, the victory validated 2 years of innovation and adaptation. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force, had transformed his force from a traditional bombing unit into something that had never existed before. It was essentially an aerial navy capable of controlling the seas without needing ships. Major Ed Larner, whose 91st Squadron had led the skip-bombing attack, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the battle. The citation praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the attack that destroyed the convoy. Tragically, Larner died just 58 days later on April 30th, 1943, when his B-25 crashed during landing at Dobodura. He had survived 87 combat missions, only to die in an accident. The North American Aviation Company immediately began incorporating guns' field modifications into their factory production lines. By late 1943, B-25G models were rolling off assembly lines with built-in forward firepower, and some even included a 75mm cannon, though the cannon proved less practical in combat than the machine guns. The B-25H model would eventually carry 14 forward-firing machine guns. The B-25J could be configured with 18 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed aircraft of the entire war. Beyond the strategic implications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented profound human tragedy. The 2,890 Japanese who died weren't just statistics in a military report. They were sons, fathers, husbands. Many were conscripts who had been farmers, clerks, or students before being drafted into a war they barely understood. For the American pilots, the military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore didn't make their actions any easier to bear psychologically. Some aircrew members reported having nightmares about the strafing missions for years afterward. The success at Bismarck Sea triggered an acceleration of American tactical innovation across all theaters. Within months, new techniques were being developed and implemented. Parafrag bombs, which were parachute fragmentation bombs for attacking airfields, allowed low-level bombing without the aircraft suffering damage from their own explosions. White phosphorus bombs for marking targets became standard. Improved skip-bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms were manufactured. Each innovation built upon America's massive industrial capacity. Americans could afford to experiment because failure only cost material resources, and material was essentially unlimited from their perspective. Japanese innovation increasingly stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources they simply didn't have. By contrast, Japanese forces increasingly relied on spiritual solutions rather than material ones to counter American advantages. The kamikaze concept, using pilots as guided missiles, emerged partly from the recognition that they couldn't match American technology in conventional terms. If they couldn't outbuild or out-innovate the Americans, the thinking went they would try to outdie them. Intelligence was crucial to the victory at Bismarck Sea. The Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and Naval Intelligence in Washington had successfully decrypted Japanese messages that revealed the convoy's schedule, route, and composition. General Kenney knew exactly when and where to strike, which allowed him to position his forces for maximum effectiveness. This intelligence advantage had to be carefully protected. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy, maintaining the fiction that visual observation rather than signals intelligence had provided the warning. The deception was so successful that Japanese forces never realized their codes were compromised. They continued using the same encryption systems throughout the war, systems that American cryptographers could read almost as easily as plain text. The Royal Australian Air Force's role in the battle demonstrated the superiority of Allied coordination. RAAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron and Bostons from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft, communicating on the same radio frequencies, following the same tactical plans. Squadron leader Bill Newton flew 3 sorties during the battle. He would later receive the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions in subsequent operations before being captured and executed by the Japanese. The integration of Australian and American forces stood in stark contrast to Japanese operations, where Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively. They often competed for scarce resources rather than cooperating toward common objectives. Behind the modified B-25s that destroyed the convoy lay an incredible supply chain that stretched back thousands of miles to American factories. Each B-25 required 165,000 individual parts that were manufactured in dozens of different states. The 50 caliber ammunition they fired was produced in plants stretching from Connecticut to California. Billions of rounds were manufactured during the course of the war. The skip bombing technique required special delayed action fuses, which were manufactured by the millions in American munitions plants. The fuel used for training flights came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by ship from the United States. This entire supply chain operated while America was simultaneously fighting in Europe, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, and maintaining forces scattered across the Pacific. The Japanese convoy that was destroyed at Bismarck Sea represented Japan's maximum possible effort to reinforce New Guinea. The forces that destroyed it represented only a tiny fraction of American production capability. The American pilots who devastated the convoy had averaged 400 flight hours before entering combat. They had practiced skip bombing for weeks, using virtually unlimited supplies of fuel and ammunition. Each pilot had dropped dozens of practice bombs before undertaking the actual mission. By contrast, Japanese pilots entering combat in 1943 increasingly had less than 100 hours of total flight time. Fuel shortages meant minimal training opportunities. The veteran pilots who might have taught them were dead, killed by the simple mathematics of American industrial production. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students who were thrown into combat against experienced American aviators who had hundreds of hours of training. After Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea were strategically isolated from resupply. Supplies had to be delivered by submarine, which was both dangerous and extremely limited in capacity. Fast destroyer runs at night offered another option, but these were equally hazardous and completely insufficient for major operations. These so-called Tokyo Express runs could deliver only a small fraction of what the destroyed convoy had been carrying. The Japanese turned to using barges, attempting to creep along the coast at night with supplies. These became targets for PT boats and modified B-25s that were equipped with radar for night hunting. By June 1943, Japanese forces in New Guinea were on half rations. By September, they were eating grass, tree bark, and roots to survive. The army that had conquered Singapore in brilliant fashion was literally starving to death, defeated not just by bullets, but by the cutting of supply lines through air power. For Japanese military culture, which was rooted in centuries of samurai tradition that emphasized personal combat and individual heroism, the industrialized slaughter at Bismarck Sea was profoundly disorienting. The spiritual preparation, the Bushido Code, the willingness to die meant nothing when facing an enemy who killed with such mechanical efficiency. Japanese forces would increasingly resort to suicidal tactics like banzai charges and kamikaze attacks, seeking some form of meaningful death in the face of mechanized killing. Americans would respond with more firepower, more technology, more industrial solutions to every problem. The gap between traditional warrior culture and industrial warfare would only widen as the conflict continued. Papillon had installed cameras in the tail sections of his modified B-25s that were activated automatically when bombs were released. These cameras captured the destruction of the convoy in devastating detail, ships exploding, capsizing, burning. The photographs provided unprecedented documentation of the battle's effectiveness. These images served multiple important purposes. They provided accurate battle damage assessment, allowing intelligence officers to verify claims about ships destroyed rather than relying solely on pilot reports. They became training aids, showing future pilots exactly how skip bombing worked under actual combat conditions. They also served as propaganda tools, demonstrating American power to both allies and enemies. The Japanese had no equivalent photographic capability in their operations. They relied on pilot reports, which were often inaccurate in the heat and confusion of combat. The B-25s that destroyed the convoy had been flying continuously for months in the harsh environmental conditions of New Guinea. Tropical heat, humidity that bred corrosion everywhere, coral dust that abraded engine components. Yet mechanical failures during the mission were remarkably rare. American engines were over-engineered, designed with power reserves that allowed them to continue functioning even when they weren't perfectly maintained. Japanese aircraft suffered from increasingly poor maintenance as the war progressed. Spare parts became scarce, qualified mechanics became even scarcer. Engines that were theoretically superior to American designs in terms of efficiency failed more frequently because they couldn't be properly maintained under field conditions. The Japanese Navy's prized Zero fighters were increasingly grounded simply for lack of spare parts, while American aircraft flew daily combat missions. During the battle, American and Australian aircraft communicated constantly via radio. Pilots reported target locations, warned each other about fighter attacks, coordinated their approaches. This real-time information sharing multiplied combat effectiveness enormously, allowing aircraft to support each other and exploit opportunities as they emerged during the fluid combat situation. Japanese communications were minimal and often completely non-functional. Radio equipment was unreliable. Frequencies weren't standardized between different services. Radio discipline was poor. Ships and aircraft often fought in isolation, unable to coordinate effectively or warn each other of developing threats. American pilots flew into battle knowing that if they were shot down and wounded, they had excellent chances of survival. Blood plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, and eventually penicillin were standard equipment in American medical kits. Medical evacuation by air was routine. Wounded pilots were often in fully equipped hospitals within hours of being shot down. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that serious wounds likely meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short even before the convoy's destruction. The medicines that might have saved lives were now resting at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. This knowledge affected morale in profound ways. American pilots flew with confidence in their support systems, while Japanese forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were on their own. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it couldn't afford to lose. The 8 transports represented months of production from Japanese shipyards that were already strained far beyond normal capacity. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant portions of total Japanese production that simply couldn't be replaced in any reasonable time frame. For America, the battle was economically insignificant. The ammunition expended was replaced within days from existing stockpiles. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from the steady stream of new production. American factories were producing 100,000 aircraft annually by 1943. That's nearly 300 aircraft per day. The fuel burned in both training and combat was essentially a rounding error in total American petroleum production. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea reverberated through the remainder of the Pacific War in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. It proved conclusively that air power alone could control sea lanes without requiring naval vessels to be present. It demonstrated that industrial innovation could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces throughout the theater, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off from reinforcement and supply, they would fight a series of desperate holding actions, each one ending in either annihilation or slow starvation. The island-hopping strategy became viable precisely because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed, left to wither without supplies. The success at Bismarck Sea accelerated B-25 development programs. The B-25G, entering service in late 1943, carried a 75mm cannon, the largest weapon ever mounted on a twin-engine bomber. Though the cannon proved less practical than multiple machine guns in actual combat, it demonstrated American willingness to experiment with radical concepts. Each iteration of the design reflected lessons learned in combat and the industrial capability to implement changes rapidly. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents revealed how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese confidence at the highest levels. Intelligence reports from the combined fleet emphasized American material superiority rather than any tactical or strategic superiority. This represented a significant shift from earlier assessments that had attributed American successes to luck or to Japanese mistakes that could be corrected. One captured report stated plainly that the enemy's production capacity allowed them to implement new tactics faster than counters could be developed. This recognition of fundamental industrial disadvantage marked a major shift in Japanese strategic thinking. After Bismarck Sea, Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive review of overall Japanese strategy in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The conclusions reached were sobering in the extreme. Surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer operationally possible. American air power had achieved operational supremacy throughout the region. The industrial gap between the two nations was widening rather than narrowing. Traditional naval superiority was irrelevant if ships couldn't survive concentrated air attack. The recommendation was to abandon all offensive operations and prepare instead for defense of what they called the inner perimeter. But even this defensive strategy assumed that American attacks would come at a pace that Japan could match, an assumption that would prove tragically optimistic. The skip bombing technique that was pioneered at Bismarck Sea spread rapidly throughout American forces in all theaters. Navy PBY Catalinas adopted it for night attacks on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots used it extensively in the Solomons campaign. Even transport pilots received training in the technique in case they encountered enemy shipping while on supply runs. This rapid proliferation was possible because America had standardized training procedures, equipment, and communications protocols. A technique developed and proven in New Guinea could be implemented in the Aleutians within a matter of weeks. Japanese forces, hampered by service rivalries and poor communication between units, rarely shared innovations effectively, even within the same theater of operations. The raw numbers tell the story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory not just possible, but almost inevitable. During World War II, American factories produced 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Ammunition plants manufactured 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Flight schools graduated 193,440 pilots. Components for every B-25 were stockpiled at multiple locations across the Pacific. Against this industrial tsunami, Japanese military courage and fighting spirit were simply irrelevant factors. The bravest samurai in history couldn't overcome the mathematics of mass production. Papygun's camera installations provided unprecedented documentation of combat effectiveness that could be analyzed scientifically. The footage was studied frame by frame, revealing optimal tactics with precision. Bomb release should occur at 200 to 250 feet altitude. Approach speed should be maintained at 245 miles per hour. Release distance should be 60 to 100 feet from target for maximum effectiveness. This scientific approach to warfare, constantly measuring, analyzing, and optimizing, was quintessentially American in character. War became fundamentally an engineering problem with industrial solutions, rather than a test of warrior spirit and individual courage. The loss of supplies at Bismarck Sea created an immediate crisis for Japanese forces throughout New Guinea. Within weeks, frontline units were reporting critical shortages of everything. Ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per day per soldier. Rice rations were reduced to 400 grams daily, barely enough for survival. Medical supplies were completely exhausted. Fuel for vehicles was unavailable. Aircraft were grounded for lack of replacement parts. American forces, by contrast, actually complained if ice cream wasn't available on a daily basis. The economic disparity was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers often refused to believe that American supply levels were real. They assumed they were being shown propaganda rather than actual standard operating conditions. Success at Bismarck Sea accelerated American innovation in aerial warfare across the board. Within months, new developments were being implemented. Improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms became standard. Napalm for area attacks on Japanese positions was developed. Rocket-assisted bombs for increased penetration were tested and deployed. White phosphorus markers for target identification became routine equipment. Each innovation built directly upon the massive industrial capacity to experiment and implement changes rapidly. Americans could afford failed experiments because they only cost material resources. Japanese innovation stagnated progressively because every single experiment consumed resources that were irreplaceable. Behind every B-25 that attacked at Bismarck Sea stood a maintenance crew working miracles to keep it flying. These men, working in primitive conditions in the jungles of New Guinea, performed daily mechanical miracles that kept the aircraft operational. Engines were completely overhauled in jungle workshops with improvised equipment. Battle damage was repaired using improvised materials when standard parts weren't available. Modifications were implemented using nothing but hand tools. Aircraft were turned around between missions in mere hours rather than days. This maintenance capability reflected American industrial training programs that had produced hundreds of thousands of men who knew how to fix engines, repair electrical systems, and work metal with precision. This vast pool of technical expertise was perhaps America's greatest single military advantage, though it's rarely discussed in conventional military histories. The strafing of survivors in the water, which remains controversial even among Americans decades later, served a harsh but calculated military purpose. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Theater learned that attempting to reach shore after their ships were sunk meant almost certain death from the air. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate battle, affecting Japanese morale and decision-making in future naval engagements. General Douglas MacArthur called Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement in the Southwest Pacific Theater. His communiqué claimed somewhat inflated Japanese losses, but the strategic impact of the battle fully justified his enthusiasm. Air power had conclusively proven it could interdict sea lanes just as effectively as submarines or surface naval vessels. Admiral Yamamoto, after reading the detailed battle reports, made what would prove to be a fateful decision. He would personally visit forward bases to boost morale that had been shattered by the devastating defeat. This decision, driven largely by the depression following Bismarck Sea, would lead directly to his death on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers learned of his travel itinerary through their routine decryption of Japanese communications. P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville, killing the man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. American forces institutionalized the lessons from Bismarck Sea with remarkable speed. Within weeks, training manuals throughout the service were updated with skip bombing techniques. New pilots were practicing low-level attacks as part of standard training. Tactical doctrine was comprehensively revised to emphasize anti-shipping operations. The Army Air Force's Tactical Center analyzed every single aspect of the battle in minute detail, producing comprehensive reports that were distributed throughout the Pacific Theater. Japanese institutional learning, by contrast, was severely hampered by systemic problems that couldn't be easily fixed. Service rivalries between Army and Navy prevented honest analysis of failures. The Army and Navy blamed each other for the disaster rather than examining fundamental weaknesses in their approach. Face-saving concerns within the rigid hierarchy obscured the real lessons that should have been learned. By the time Japanese forces finally developed partial counters to skip bombing tactics, the Americans had already moved on to implementing new and different tactics. The B-25 modifications that proved so devastatingly successful went into mass production almost immediately. North American Aviation's factories in Kansas City and Inglewood retooled their production lines within mere weeks of receiving the specifications. By late 1943, new B-25s were coming directly from the factory with 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment. Reinforced nose structure for gun installation was built in from the start. Engines were upgraded and optimized specifically for low-level performance characteristics. Improved armor protection for crew members was standard. Built-in camera installations for battle documentation were included. This rapid transition from field modification using salvage parts to standardized mass production exemplified American industrial flexibility that Japan simply couldn't match under any circumstances. After Bismarck Sea, American bomber crew training incorporated low-level attack techniques as absolutely standard curriculum across all training commands. Pilots practiced skip bombing at training bases scattered across Texas and Arizona. Target ships were positioned in the Gulf of Mexico and the Salton Sea for realistic practice. This training consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Each individual pilot consumed thousands of gallons of aviation fuel just learning the technique properly. But America could easily afford it. By 1943, American refineries were producing 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually, while Japan was struggling desperately just to import enough fuel to keep its remaining fleet operational for essential missions. Several B-25s returned from the Bismarck Sea battle with significant battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. Holes from shell fragments damaged control surfaces, engines that had been shot up. Within 72 hours, every single damaged aircraft was flying combat missions again. They'd been repaired using aluminum patches that were fabricated right there in field workshops. Damaged engines were replaced using improvised hoists and tackles. Control cables were spliced together using salvaged materials scavenged from wherever they could be found. Fuel tanks were patched using rubber cut from destroyed Japanese equipment. Japanese aircraft suffering similar damage levels would have been immediately written off as total losses, then cannibalized for any spare parts that might be salvageable for use in other aircraft. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing operationally possible were genuine marvels of precision engineering. They were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. They had to survive the tremendous shock of hitting water at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. They had to function reliably after multiple skips across the surface. They had to detonate at precisely the right moment, not too early and not too late. American factories produced these precision fuses by the millions, with each one individually tested and certified before being shipped. Japanese fuses, by comparison, had failure rates exceeding 20% by 1943. This was due to increasing quality control problems and severe shortages of proper materials needed for precision manufacturing. American aircraft found the Japanese convoy at precisely the expected time and location, despite the weather conditions and the distances involved. This reflected clear superiority in multiple areas of navigation training. American pilots averaged 400 hours of flight time before seeing combat. They had superior navigation equipment, including accurate compasses and instruments. Map quality was excellent, with detailed charts that had been prepared from pre-war surveys and constant reconnaissance. Weather forecasting was sophisticated, with meteorological support that could accurately predict when the weather would clear. Japanese navigation was increasingly reduced to simply following lead aircraft or using coastal landmarks for reference, which severely limited their operational flexibility. American intelligence had known about the convoy in advance through code-breaking operations, but this secret had to be carefully protected from Japanese knowledge. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy through visual observation, maintaining the complete fiction that visual sighting, rather than signals intelligence, had provided the initial warning. The deception was so thoroughly successful that Japanese forces never realized their most secure codes had been completely compromised. They continued using the same encryption systems that American cryptographers could read almost in real time throughout the remainder of the war. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who eventually reached Leh found a garrison that was already on severely reduced rations. The supplies that were supposed to sustain major operations for months ahead had been destroyed in the Bismarck Sea. Within weeks, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for any kind of food in the jungle environment. Disease became epidemic throughout the garrison. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and simple malnutrition decimated entire units. By June of 1943, the effective combat strength of Japanese forces in Leh had been reduced by 60% through disease and starvation alone, without significant combat losses. American pilots at Bismarck Sea were operating under a system of limited combat tours. Typically 50 missions or 6 months of combat duty, whichever came first, before rotation back home to serve as instructors for new pilots. This system preserved hard-won combat experience and disseminated crucial lessons throughout the entire force. Veterans became instructors, passing on their combat techniques to the next generation of pilots in a continuous cycle. Japanese pilots, by contrast, flew combat missions until they were killed. There was no rotation system. The expertise that had been gained at terrible cost was lost forever the moment they died. By late 1943, most of Japan's experienced pilots were dead. Their replacements were increasingly poorly trained novices who were facing American combat veterans with hundreds of hours of experience. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a convergence of multiple American technological advantages, all coming together at once. Industrial capacity allowed them to produce modified aircraft in quantity. An innovation culture permitted field modifications to be implemented rapidly. Training resources allowed for perfecting new tactics through extensive practice. Intelligence capability enabled them to locate targets with precision. Communication systems facilitated coordinating highly complex attacks involving multiple units. Supply chains sustained continuous operations over vast distances. No single advantage was individually decisive. But their combination created an overwhelming superiority that Japan simply couldn't counter. The battle demonstrated conclusively that air power alone could control sea lanes without requiring naval vessels. Industrial innovation proved it could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. American production showed that quantity, when properly applied through sound tactics, had a quality all its own that couldn't be matched by spirit or courage alone. For the Japanese military establishment, Bismarck Sea was far more than just another defeat in a long war. It was proof that their entire fundamental approach to warfare had become completely obsolete. Courage meant nothing against mechanical precision. Fighting spirit was irrelevant when facing industrial capacity. Martial tradition was useless against B-25s, carrying 8 forward-firing machine guns and dropping skip bombs with scientific precision. The best trained warrior in their tradition was utterly helpless against an enemy who had successfully industrialized warfare itself. The 2,890 Japanese who died in those waters were victims not simply of American bombs and bullets. They were casualties of a technological and industrial revolution that had made their entire form of warfare as obsolete as the samurai swords their culture venerated. They had trained extensively for war against other warriors, following similar traditions. Instead, they died in a war against machines and industrial systems they had no capacity to match. For the Americans who fought at Bismarck Sea, the victory validated years of preparation and continuous innovation. Papillon's field modifications, developed using salvaged parts and basic hand tools, had proven more effective in combat than any purpose-built weapon system. The marriage of American mechanical ingenuity and massive industrial capacity had produced a genuinely new form of warfare that Japan simply had no way to counter effectively. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate Southwest Pacific theater. It demonstrated definitively that in modern industrial warfare, industrial capacity essentially equals military capacity. The nation that can build the most weapons, train the most personnel, innovate the fastest, and adapt the quickest will ultimately prevail. Traditional military virtues like courage, loyalty, and willingness to sacrifice remained important factors, but they were no longer sufficient by themselves to determine outcomes. In 15 minutes of combat over the Bismarck Sea, 8 modified bombers accomplished something that the entire Imperial Japanese Navy couldn't prevent despite all their efforts. They completely cut Japan's supply lines to New Guinea and doomed its forces there to eventual starvation and defeat. Those 15 minutes marked the decisive moment when industrial warfare definitively replaced traditional military concepts throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese soldiers and sailors, who couldn't believe what they were witnessing as it happened, were absolutely right to be incredulous. They were seeing something that shouldn't have been possible according to everything they'd been taught about naval warfare throughout their careers. But American industrial innovation had made the previously impossible into routine standard procedure. The unthinkable had become simply standard operating practice. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands in history as definitive proof that in modern warfare, the nation with superior factories defeats the nation with the bravest soldiers. It was a lesson written in flames across the waters of the Huon Gulf, a lesson that would define every subsequent engagement in the Pacific War. In the age of industrial warfare, production capacity equals power, innovation equals strategy. The assembly line proves ultimately mightier than any sword. The Japanese simply could not believe it when B-25 strafers destroyed 8 ships in 15 minutes of sustained attack. By the time they finally accepted this new reality, it was already far too late to matter. The war had effectively been lost, not in those 15 minutes of destruction over the Bismarck Sea, but in the years of industrial preparation that made those 15 minutes of devastation possible in the first place. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was simply the moment when that long-prepared victory became undeniably visible to everyone who witnessed it.